The autumn winds swept through the quiet suburban streets of Cedar Grove as Officer David Thompson's wife, Lisa, loaded groceries into her car. It had been a routine Saturday afternoon shopping trip, but something felt different today. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as she sensed a presence behind her. Trying to appear casual, she glanced over her shoulder, pretending to check her purse. That's when she first noticed the little girl, couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, standing near the cart return, wearing a faded blue dress despite the chilly weather. The child wasn't doing anything threatening, she was simply watching Lisa with large, solemn eyes. Lisa smiled and waved, but the girl didn't wave back. She just stood there, hands clasped in front of her, looking lost and somehow much older than her years. When Lisa finished loading her groceries and drove away, she couldn't shake the image of those haunting eyes from her mind. The following Tuesday, Lisa was tending to her front garden when she spotted the same little girl walking past their house. The child slowed down as she approached, her eyes fixed on Lisa with that same intense gaze. This time, Lisa noticed details she'd missed before: worn-out sneakers, uncombed hair, and what looked like a small bruise near her collarbone. "Hi there," Lisa called out gently, but the girl quickened her pace and disappeared around the corner. That evening, as David sat at their kitchen table still in his police uniform, Lisa shared her concerns. "I've seen this same little girl twice now," she explained, stirring her tea absently. "Something's not right, David. I can feel it in my gut." David had learned long ago to trust his wife's intuition. 20 years of marriage to a kindergarten teacher had taught him that Lisa had an uncanny ability to read situations involving children. "Tell me everything you've noticed," he said, pulling out his notebook. As Lisa described her encounters, David's expression grew more serious. The description of the girl didn't match any missing persons reports he'd seen recently, but something about the situation raised red flags. The following day, he decided to adjust his patrol route to include the area where Lisa had seen the girl. For 3 days, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then, on Friday afternoon, David spotted her, a small figure in a blue dress, walking alone along the sidewalk. He slowed his patrol car, observing how she kept close to the buildings, almost as if trying to blend into the shadows. When she noticed his police car, she didn't run like most kids would. Instead, she stopped and stared, just as Lisa had described. David pulled over and stepped out of his car, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Hi there," he said warmly, crouching down to appear less intimidating. "I'm Officer Thompson. My wife Lisa told me about you. Would you like to tell me your name?" The girl remained silent, but her eyes darted between David and something over his shoulder. Following her gaze, David noticed an old brown sedan parked across the street, its engine running. The driver's face was obscured, but David could make out the outline of a man watching them intently. Years of police work had honed David's instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something was very wrong. He reached for his radio, keeping his voice calm as he called for backup. "Dispatch, this is Officer Thompson. I'm going to need additional units at my location." The moment he began speaking into his radio, the brown sedan's engine revved. The girl's eyes widened in fear, and she took a small step backward. David made a split-second decision that would change multiple lives forever. "It's okay," he said softly, holding out his hand. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." The girl's lower lip trembled, and for the first time, David saw a crack in her stoic facade. A single tear rolled down her cheek as distant sirens began to wail in the background. The brown sedan peeled away from the curb, but David didn't chase after it. He knew his fellow officers would intercept the vehicle. Right now, this frightened little girl needed him more than anything else. As she finally reached out to take his hand, David realized this was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would uncover a web of secrets hidden beneath the peaceful facade of their suburban community. The simple act of his wife noticing a child following her had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to one of the most significant cases of his career. What started as a mother's intuition had become something much more significant. As backup arrived and the first phase of their investigation began, David couldn't help but wonder, how many other secrets were hiding in plain sight on these quiet suburban streets? And more importantly, how many other children like this one were waiting for someone to notice them? The police station buzzed with activity as Officer David Thompson sat with the little girl in the children's interview room. Social services had brought clean clothes and food, but she still hadn't spoken a word. The child psychologist, Dr. Chen, observed through the two-way mirror, taking notes on the girl's behavior. "Would you like to draw?" David asked, sliding some paper and crayons across the table. The girl hesitated before picking up a blue crayon. Her small hands trembled as she began to draw. Meanwhile, in another room, Detective Rivera was reviewing the footage from nearby security cameras. The brown sedan had been identified as a 2008 Toyota Camry with stolen plates. The driver had managed to evade the initial pursuit, but they now had clear images of the vehicle and a partial view of the driver. Lisa arrived at the station, carrying a stuffed bear from her classroom collection. The moment she walked into the interview room, the little girl's eyes lit up with recognition. It was the first real emotion they'd seen from her. "Hi, sweetie," Lisa said softly, placing the bear on the table. "I brought you a friend. His name is Mr. Cuddles, and he's very good at keeping secrets." The girl reached for the bear, hugging it close to her chest. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said her first words, "My name is Grace." David felt his heart skip a beat. It was a breakthrough, but what came next broke his heart. Grace pointed to her drawing, a house with bars on the windows, and several stick figures of children inside. "There are more," she whispered, clutching Mr. Cuddles tighter. "In the blue house." Detective Rivera entered the room, gesturing for David to step outside. In the hallway, her expression was grim. "We've got something." The sedan's been spotted at multiple locations around town over the past 3 months. Always near schools or playgrounds. David's jaw tightened. Human trafficking? Looks like it. But here's where it gets complicated. The car's registered to a local charity organization, Second Chance Youth Center. On paper, they're legitimate. They've been operating in the area for 5 years. Back in the interview room, Grace was opening up to Lisa. She spoke of other children, some younger, some older, all kept in what she called the waiting room. They were told they were being prepared for their new families, but Grace had overheard different plans. As Grace talked, Dr. Chen took detailed notes. The pattern was clear: the organization was targeting vulnerable children, especially those from troubled homes or foster care. They used the legitimacy of their charity status as a cover for something far more sinister. David's team worked through the night, piecing together the evidence. The driver of the sedan was identified as Robert Walsh, a former social worker with a spotless record. Too spotless, as Detective Rivera pointed out. His background's been sanitized. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make him look clean. Lisa stayed at the station, having formed a bond with Grace that the child psychologist deemed crucial for the investigation. As midnight approached, Grace drew another picture, this time of a calendar with dates circled in red. "That's when the van comes," she explained quietly. "To take kids to their new families." The next date was circled for tomorrow. David and Detective Rivera immediately began coordinating with neighboring jurisdictions. They needed to move fast, but they also needed to be careful. One wrong move could spook the organization and put more children at risk. Through the night, surveillance teams were positioned around the Second Chance Youth Center. Technical experts worked to decrypt the organization's computer systems, while financial analysts traced money trails that stretched across state lines. Grace fell asleep on a couch in the break room, still clutching Mr. Cuddles. Lisa sat nearby, running her fingers through the child's hair. "She's so brave," she whispered to David. "All this time, she wasn't just following me because she needed help, she was trying to show us where to look." As dawn approached, David received a call from one of the surveillance teams. A white van had just pulled up to the youth center. It was time to move. "Stay with her," David told Lisa, kissing her forehead. "She'll need you when she wakes up." As David headed out with the tactical team, he couldn't help but think about how this all started, with his wife noticing a little girl who seemed out of place. It reminded him of something his police academy instructor once said: "The biggest cases don't always start with a bang. Sometimes they start with a whisper, a gut feeling, or just someone paying attention when others look away." The morning sun was just beginning to paint the sky pink as multiple police vehicles converged on the Second Chance Youth Center. What they would find inside would shock the community and make headlines across the state. But more importantly, it would bring hope to families who had been searching for their children for months. David checked his vest one last time as the tactical team took their positions. In his ear, the radio crackled with final coordinates. The operation was about to begin, and thanks to one brave little girl and one observant wife, they were about to uncover one of the largest trafficking operations in the state's history. The tactical team moved silently through the morning mist surrounding the Second Chance Youth Center. Officer David Thompson's heart pounded as he took his position near the rear entrance. The white van's engine was still warm, they had arrived just in time. Through his earpiece, he heard the tactical commander's steady voice: "All units in position. On my mark." David gripped his weapon tighter, thinking of Grace's drawings, of the bars on windows, of children waiting in rooms for new families that would never come. Execute. 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 The synchronized breach happened in seconds. Flashbangs deployed at multiple entry points, followed by the coordinated rush of tactical teams. David's unit secured the rear corridor while other teams swept through the building's main areas. "Clear. Clear. We need medical in the East Wing." David moved forward with his team, checking room after room. The building's interior looked nothing like a typical youth center. Heavy locks on outside of doors. Cameras everywhere. Small rooms with basic cots. But most were empty. Then they heard it, muffled sounds coming from behind a wall panel in what appeared to be an office. Detective Rivera discovered the hidden latch, revealing a narrow staircase leading to a basement level not shown in any building plans. The scene below made even veteran officers pause. A dozen children, ages ranging from 6 to 15, huddled together in a large room. Some clutched small backpacks, others held onto each other. They had clearly been prepared for transport. "It's okay now," David said softly, lowering his weapon. "We're the police. You're safe." A small boy stepped forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you really police?" he asked in a trembling voice. "They said nobody would ever find us." Upstairs, the operation continued to unfold. 3 suspects were taken into custody, including Robert Walsh, the man from the brown sedan. But the organization's leader was nowhere to be found. As medical teams arrived to check the children, David noticed something odd about the basement walls. Behind some storage boxes, he discovered a hidden door leading to a tunnel. "Rivera," he called out. "We've got another exit." The tunnel stretched for nearly a block, emerging in an abandoned warehouse. Fresh tire tracks in the dust indicated someone had fled recently. But they hadn't escaped empty-handed. Security footage from a nearby business showed a black SUV speeding away just minutes before the raid, with what appeared to be filing cabinets visible through the windows. Back at the youth center, technology specialists were already working to recover deleted files from the organization's computers. The children were being transported to the hospital for evaluation, each accompanied by an officer and social worker. David called Lisa, who was still at the station with Grace. "We found them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace was right about everything. But the leader got away with documents. We think they might have information about other operations." Grace had woken up and was listening on speakerphone. For the first time, she spoke without hesitation. "Check the pictures on the wall," she said. "The ones in the big office. They're not real pictures." Detective Rivera was already in the office Grace described. "Thompson, get up here," she called out. The walls were lined with framed photographs showing the charity's supposed success stories, children with their new families. Rivera carefully removed one frame from the wall, revealing a small safe behind it. Inside, they found USB drives, ledgers, and most importantly, a laptop. The organization had been meticulous in documenting everything, probably as insurance against their own members. But they had never expected anyone to find this hidden cache. As the evidence was catalogued, David noticed a familiar face in one of the photographs. The charity's board chairman, standing next to the mayor at a fundraising event. The same man whose black SUV had been caught on camera fleeing the scene. "We've got an ID on our runner," Rivera announced, hanging up her phone. "Thomas Blackwood. Respected businessman, major political donor, philanthropist. His fingerprints are all over this operation, but he's been invisible to law enforcement because of his connections." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a local trafficking ring, it was part of a sophisticated network that used charitable organizations as fronts, all while hiding behind a veil of respectability and political influence. One of the rescued children, a girl about Grace's age, approached David. "Is Grace okay?" she asked quietly. "She told us she would find help." Nobody believed her, but she said there was a kind lady who would notice her. David felt his throat tighten. "Yes, Grace is safe. And you're all safe now too." As the morning wore on, parents who had been searching for their missing children for months began arriving at the hospital. The reunions were emotional, but David couldn't help thinking about Blackwood, still at large with sensitive documents. Back at the station, Grace was helping investigators identify more locations from photos found in the safe. Lisa sat beside her, offering quiet support as the girl showed remarkable courage in facing her fears to help others. "There are more places," Grace said, pointing to various images. "More houses with bars on the windows." David and Rivera exchanged looks. This case was far from over. Blackwood was still out there, and there were likely other facilities yet to be discovered. But thanks to one little girl's bravery and one woman's attentiveness, they had struck a significant blow against an organization that had operated in shadows for years. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, David knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger investigation. But for now, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. 12 children would sleep safely tonight, and Grace, the brave little girl who started it all, had found her voice at last. The investigation room hummed with activity as Officer David Thompson studied the evidence wall. Photos, documents, and connection maps covered every inch, all leading to Thomas Blackwood, the man who had slipped through their fingers. It had been 48 hours since the raid, and the case was growing larger by the hour. Detective Rivera burst through the door, waving a file. "We've got something from the laptop's encrypted files. Blackwood wasn't just running operations here, he has facilities in 3 neighboring states. All operating under different charity names, all connected to his main corporation." David's phone buzzed, a message from Lisa. Grace had remembered something important and wanted to talk to him immediately. He grabbed his jacket and headed to the safe house where Grace and several other children were being protected. When he arrived, Grace was sitting at a table with a fresh stack of drawing paper. But instead of crayons, she was using different colored sticky notes to mark locations on a map. Lisa stood nearby, helping Grace organize her thoughts. "I remember the car rides," Grace explained, her voice stronger now. "When they moved us between houses. I counted streets and remembered stores we passed. She pointed to various markers on the map. The blue house wasn't the only one. There's a yellow house near the train tracks, and a white one with a broken windmill in the yard. David called in the locations, and surveillance teams were dispatched immediately. Grace had provided them with something invaluable, first-hand intelligence about active locations that wouldn't be in any official documents. Meanwhile, forensic accountants had traced a complex web of financial transactions linking Blackwood's legitimate businesses to offshore accounts. The charity organizations were just the surface. Beneath them lay a sophisticated money laundering operation that had processed millions of dollars. The documents Blackwood took, Rivera theorized, they're not just about the trafficking. They're evidence of who's been paying for these kids. High-profile clients, politicians, maybe even foreign interests. The FBI had joined the investigation, bringing additional resources and jurisdiction. Agent Patel, the lead investigator, shared troubling news. We've found similar patterns in other cities. Same setup, respected charitable organizations, political connections, all linked to seemingly legitimate businesses. As they discussed strategy, another officer rushed in. One of the surveillance teams had spotted activity at the yellow house Grace mentioned. A moving truck had arrived, and people were quickly loading furniture. They're cleaning house, David realized. Blackwood must have someone inside the department feeding him information. Teams mobilized immediately, but they had to move carefully. If there was indeed a leak, they needed to control what information went through official channels. David thought about Grace's drawings, her careful observations, her courage in coming forward. We need to think like them, he said suddenly. These kids, they see everything, but the traffickers don't pay attention because they're just children. What else might they have noticed that we're missing? He returned to the safe house, where Grace was now helping other rescued children mark their own memories on maps. Together, they began piecing together a pattern that had been invisible to the investigators. One boy remembered a weekly delivery truck that always came on Tuesdays. Another recalled overhearing phone conversations about shipments to Canada. A teenage girl remembered specific names mentioned and the traffickers thought the children were asleep. Lisa, who had been helping the children feel safe enough to share their stories, noticed something in their collective memories. The moving companies, she said. The kids all mentioned different company names, but the trucks always had the same driver. David quickly cross-referenced this with traffic camera footage from the past month. The same driver appeared in multiple locations, always in trucks with different company logos. It was a breakthrough. They had identified another key player in the organization. Within hours, they had a name, Frank Carter, a former logistics manager with connections to several of Blackwood's legitimate businesses. More importantly, they had his current location, thanks to a truck's GPS tracker. As SWAT teams prepared to move in on Carter's location, David received an urgent call from one of the forensic analysts. They'd cracked another layer of encryption on the laptop, revealing documents that implicated several high-ranking city officials in Blackwood's operation. This goes deeper than we thought, Rivera said grimly. These officials, they weren't just taking bribes. They were actively helping to identify vulnerable kids in the system, manipulating records to make them disappear. The weight of this revelation settled heavily over the investigation room. They weren't just fighting a criminal organization, they were up against corruption that had infected the very systems meant to protect these children. Grace, who had been dozing on a couch in the safe house, suddenly sat up. The beach house, she said clearly. Mr. Blackwood always talked about the beach house. He said it was where all the important papers were kept safe. Lisa gently helped Grace remember more details. The girl described a distinctive lighthouse visible from the house's windows, and specific sounds she'd heard during her brief time there, foghorns, seagulls, and a particular bell that rang every hour. David and Rivera pored over coastal maps, cross-referencing lighthouse locations with property records connected to Blackwood's various shell companies. As night fell, satellite images revealed a promising location, a secluded property on a private stretch of coastline, purchased through a series of dummy corporations. As they prepared to coordinate raids on both Carter's location and the beach house, David took a moment to sit with Grace. "You've helped us more than you know," he told her softly. "You're the bravest person I've ever met." Grace hugged Mr. Cuddles closer. "I just didn't want any more kids to be scared like I was," she replied. "Is it really almost over?" David looked at the evidence wall, now covered with the children's drawings alongside police reports and financial records. "Almost," he promised. "And it's all because you were brave enough to follow Lisa that day." As tactical teams geared up for the night's operations, David knew they were close to unraveling Blackwood's entire network. But more importantly, they were close to ensuring that no more children would have to be as brave as Grace had been. The night air carried the salt scent of the ocean as tactical teams took their positions around the beach house. Officer David Thompson checked his gear one final time, the weight of his vest familiar but somehow heavier tonight. In his earpiece, he could hear the coordinated movements of the second team positioning themselves around Frank Carter's location across town. Detective Rivera's voice came through clearly, "Team 2 in position at Carter's warehouse. Satellite confirms heat signatures inside both locations. Beach house team, status?" "Ready," David responded, his eyes fixed on the illuminated windows of the seaside property. Through thermal imaging, they could detect at least 3 people moving inside. One figure matched Blackwood's height and build. The lighthouse beam swept across the water in steady intervals, its rhythm matching David's heartbeat. Each flash illuminated the waves crashing against the rocky shore below the house. The same waves Grace had described hearing from behind locked doors. "Execute on my mark," the tactical commander's voice crackled through the radio. 3, 2, 1. Execute. Both raids launched simultaneously. At the beach house, flashbangs erupted through broken windows as teams breached from multiple entry points. David's unit took the rear entrance, moving swiftly through a modern kitchen where papers were still burning in a metal trash can. "Suspect fleeing to the second floor," someone called out. David and 2 other officers rushed up the stairs, following the sound of running footsteps. Across town, Team 2 encountered armed resistance at the warehouse. "Shots fired. Shots fired." Rivera's voice remained steady despite the chaos. "Carter is attempting to destroy evidence. We need fire suppression units." In the beach house, David rounded a corner to find Thomas Blackwood attempting to access a hidden wall safe. The man spun around, holding a USB drive in one hand and reaching for something in his jacket with the other. "Police. Show me your hands," David commanded, his weapon trained on Blackwood's chest. For a moment, their eyes met, and David saw what Grace must have seen, cold calculation behind a mask of respectability. Blackwood's hand emerged holding not a weapon, but a phone. "Officer Thompson," he said smoothly, knowing David's name without being told. "Let's be reasonable. There are people who would pay very well to keep what's on this drive private. Name your price." "On your knees," David responded, advancing steadily. "Hands behind your head." Blackwood's confident smile faltered. "Think about your career, officer. Think about your wife, Lisa. Teaching can be such a dangerous profession these days." The threat to Lisa made David's blood boil, but his hands remained steady. "I said on your knees. Last warning." At the warehouse, Rivera's team had subdued the resistance and prevented Carter from destroying most of the evidence. "Carter is in custody," she reported. "Multiple computers and documents secured. Team 1, what's your status?" The sound of breaking glass drew David's attention for a split second, just long enough for Blackwood to throw the phone at David's face and lunge for the balcony doors. David recovered quickly, tackling Blackwood inches from the threshold. "Thompson, report." Rivera's voice was urgent in his ear. "Suspect in custody," David responded, securing handcuffs around Blackwood's wrists. USB drive recovered. Evidence vault located. As additional officers secured the scene, David found himself thinking about Grace. She had described the beach house perfectly, even the smell of the salt air and the sound of the waves. Her careful observations had helped them track down not just this location, but an entire network of safe houses and corrupt officials. The evidence they recovered that night was staggering. The USB drive contained detailed records of every transaction, every corrupt official, every child trafficked through their network. The burning papers in the kitchen had been partial copies, but the originals were safe in the wall vault. Back at the station, Lisa waited with Grace as the raids unfolded. When David called to report their success, Grace's reaction surprised everyone. She didn't cry or cheer, she simply nodded and said, "I knew you would find them." The good people always win if someone is brave enough to help them. The investigation room transformed into a command center as federal agents arrived to process the seized evidence. The documents implicated politicians, business leaders, and criminal organizations across multiple countries. What had started with one little girl following a kind woman would end up dismantling one of the largest trafficking networks in North America. Detective Rivera found David staring at Grace's original drawings, still pinned to the evidence wall. "You know," she said quietly, "in all my years on the force, I've never seen anything quite like this. A child's courage and a woman's kindness bringing down an entire criminal empire." David thought about the moment Lisa first noticed Grace following her in the grocery store parking lot. How many others had seen the same girl and looked away? How many had noticed something wrong but chosen not to get involved? The sun was rising as David finally headed home, exhausted but satisfied. Lisa met him at the door, and they held each other in silence, both thinking about the children who would sleep safely tonight because one little girl refused to remain invisible. Grace's story would eventually help change protocols for handling suspected trafficking cases. Her detailed observations and drawings would be used to train officers in recognizing patterns and listening to children's accounts. But perhaps most importantly, her courage would inspire others to speak up, to pay attention, to act when something seemed wrong. As David and Lisa sat on their porch, watching the morning light spread across their quiet suburban street, they knew their lives had changed forever. Sometimes the biggest differences in the world start with the smallest actions: a woman noticing a child in need, a police officer believing a little girl's drawings, and a community coming together to protect its most vulnerable members. The days following the raids brought a whirlwind of activity as the full scope of Blackwood's operation came to light. Officer David Thompson sat in the Federal Command Center, watching as analysts processed thousands of documents recovered from both locations. The evidence board had grown so large it now covered an entire wall, with red strings connecting photos, documents, and Grace's drawings. Agent Patel approached with a thick file. The USB drive was a goldmine, she said, spreading photos across the table. Blackwood kept records of every transaction, every corrupt official, every child. He was using it as insurance against his own associates. The photos showed prominent figures meeting with Blackwood, judges who had helped fast-track suspicious adoptions, police officers who had looked the other way, politicians who had ensured certain investigations went nowhere. Each image told a story of power and betrayal. Lisa had taken temporary leave from her teaching job to help support the rescued children. Her classroom experience proved invaluable as she worked with child psychologists to help the young survivors feel safe enough to share their stories. Grace had become something of a leader among them, showing others that it was okay to speak up. "We've identified 3 more facilities based on the children's testimonies," Detective Rivera reported during the morning briefing. 2 in Canada and 1 in Mexico. International task forces are preparing to move on all locations simultaneously. David studied the map where each known location was marked. Grace's original drawings had been the first pieces of the puzzle, but now they had a complete picture of an organization that spanned continents. The supposedly charitable youth centers were just the visible part of a massive criminal enterprise. The investigation had also uncovered a disturbing pattern in how the organization selected its victims. They targeted children who seemed unlikely to be missed, those in troubled homes, in overwhelmed foster care systems, or from communities where police were traditionally mistrusted. Blackwood's lawyers are trying to cut a deal, Agent Patel announced. He's offering to name names in exchange for leniency. But here's the interesting part, he seems more afraid of his associates than of prison. David thought about Grace's quiet determination, how she had risked everything to seek help. Let him worry, he said. We have something better than his confession. We have the truth from the children themselves. As if to prove his point, a new piece of evidence arrived. One of the older girls had remembered a song that played every day at specific times in one of the facilities. A tech analyst had traced it to a remote radio station near the Canadian border, helping narrow down the search area for another suspected location. Lisa called from the safe house with unexpected news. Grace had recognized someone in the photographs recovered from the beach house, a woman who had visited multiple facilities, claiming to be a social worker. Grace says she was the one who decided which children would be moved and when, Lisa explained. She carried a red notebook with gold corners. The description matched a woman seen in security footage from 2 other locations. They now had another key player to track down, thanks to a detail only a child would have noticed. The investigation was also revealing the sophisticated methods used to hide the trafficking operation. The charity organizations had been hosting legitimate events, helping real children, all while using these good works as cover for their criminal activities. They had even won humanitarian awards. It's like looking at a photo negative, Rivera observed. Everything that made them seem trustworthy was actually a sign of how deep the deception went. Late that evening, as David reviewed surveillance footage from the beach house raid, he noticed something in Blackwood's behavior. The man had been too calm, too confident, even as his empire crumbled around him. He has another backup plan, David realized. The USB drive and the documents, they're not everything. A thorough search of Blackwood's properties had revealed multiple hidden compartments and safes, but David suspected there was more. He returned to Grace's drawings, studying the details she had included. In one corner of a picture showing the beach house, she had drawn what looked like a boat. Did anyone check the marina? David asked suddenly. Grace drew a boat, and we know Blackwood had multiple escape routes planned. A quick check revealed that Blackwood owned a slip at a private marina under one of his shell companies. When teams searched the boat, they found another hidden compartment containing additional drives and documents, along with emergency supplies and fake passports. The discovery proved crucial. These new documents revealed connections to trafficking organizations in other countries, along with details of planned operations that hadn't yet begun. Thanks to Grace's detailed drawings, they had found the evidence needed to prevent future crimes. As the investigation expanded, more survivors began coming forward. Grace's courage had created a ripple effect, showing others that they would be believed, that their stories mattered. Each new testimony helped build a stronger case and identify more perpetrators. Lisa spent hours with the children, helping them process their experiences through art and play therapy. They're not just witnesses, she told David. They're heroes, every one of them. They kept their humanity in a place designed to strip it away. The investigation was far from over, but they had dealt a devastating blow to an organization that had operated with impunity for years. And it had all started because a little girl had been brave enough to follow a kind woman, and that woman had been caring enough to notice. The Federal Command Center had transformed into an international hub as law enforcement agencies from multiple countries coordinated their efforts. Officer David Thompson watched as Interpol agents added new locations to the digital map, each point representing another facility discovered through evidence from Blackwood's operation. The woman with the red notebook had been identified as Dr. Catherine Wells, a child psychologist who had worked with prestigious institutions worldwide. Her credentials had given her access to vulnerable children across multiple countries. Now she was the subject of an international manhunt. "We've located her," Agent Patel announced, rushing into the command center. Facial recognition picked her up at an airport in Singapore. Local authorities are moving in. Grace's detailed description of the notebook had proved crucial. When investigators knew what to look for, they found images of Dr. Wells carrying the same red notebook in surveillance footage from multiple facilities. The gold corners glinted in every frame, a beacon pointing to her involvement. Back at the safe house, the number of survivors willing to share their stories had grown. Lisa had established a routine that helped them feel secure: morning art therapy, afternoon study sessions, and evening group activities. The children were slowly reclaiming their voices. "They found more kids like us," Grace told Lisa during their daily drawing session. She was sketching a picture of a classroom, filled with smiling faces. "Can we send them Mr. Cuddle's friends? They might be scared too." Lisa's kindergarten class had learned about the rescue operation, not the frightening details, but the story of brave children helping others. They had organized a stuffed animal drive, ensuring every rescued child would have a comfort item of their own. The international raids had been successful. 17 facilities across 8 countries were shut down simultaneously, preventing the trafficking network from destroying evidence or moving children. Each location revealed new layers of the organization's complexity. David reviewed footage from the coordinated raids. In each facility, they found the same meticulous record-keeping system Blackwood had used. The organization's obsession with documentation had become its undoing, providing prosecutors with overwhelming evidence. Detective Rivera coordinated with international teams, piecing together the network's financial structure. "They were using international aid organizations as covers," she explained. "Every legitimate donation was matched by illegal funds. The charity work wasn't just a front, it was a laundering operation." Dr. Wells' arrest in Singapore yielded another breakthrough. The red notebook contained coded references to prominent clients worldwide: politicians, celebrities, business leaders. Each entry represented a child's fate, decided with cold efficiency. She was the architect, Agent Patel revealed. Blackwood provided the infrastructure, but Wells designed the whole system. Her background in child psychology helped her identify vulnerable children and manipulate them psychologically. The investigation had grown beyond anything they had imagined, and Grace first followed Lisa in that parking lot. What started as one child's cry for help had exposed a network that had operated for decades, hidden behind a veil of respectability and charitable works. Lisa found Grace looking at news coverage of the international raids on a tablet. Unlike the other children, who avoided any mention of their ordeal, Grace seemed to draw strength from seeing the organization dismantled. "They can't hurt anyone else now," Grace said quietly. "All the scary houses are empty." The evidence gathered led to hundreds of arrests worldwide. Corrupt officials were exposed, legitimate charities were purged of criminal influences, and most importantly, families torn apart by the trafficking network began to heal. David received word that Blackwood had finally started talking. Faced with evidence from multiple countries and abandoned by his powerful friends, he began revealing details about operations even Grace hadn't known about. "There's something you should see," Rivera told David one evening. She played a security video from one of the international facilities. A small girl was following a woman through a market, using the same technique Grace had used with Lisa. "It's happening everywhere. Children are speaking up because they heard about Grace." The story had spread through international media, carefully, protecting the survivors' identities, but sharing the essential truth: that the courage of one child and the kindness of one woman had brought down an international criminal empire. Lisa's school district had implemented new training programs, teaching staff to recognize signs of trafficking and abuse. Other districts worldwide were adopting similar protocols, creating a network of vigilant protectors in places where children should be safest. As David and Lisa sat in their living room that evening, they read messages from law enforcement agencies around the world. Each told similar stories, of children finding their voices, of communities coming together, of evil hiding in plain sight finally exposed to the light. "Grace asked me something today," Lisa said softly. "She wanted to know if she could help teach other kids how to stay safe. She said sometimes the best helpers are the ones who understand being hurt." David thought about how this case had started, with one small shadow following his wife through a parking lot, and how it had grown into a movement that was changing how the world protected its most vulnerable members. 6 months had passed since the international raids. Officer David Thompson stood in the courthouse corridor, watching Grace walk confidently toward the witness stand. She had insisted on testifying at Blackwood's trial, despite having the option to appear via video link. The prosecution had built an airtight case. Evidence from 8 countries, testimonies from hundreds of survivors, and mountains of documentation left no room for doubt. But Grace's testimony would put a human face on the statistics and spreadsheets. Lisa sat in the gallery, surrounded by other survivors and their families. The kindergarten teacher who had noticed a shadow in a parking lot was now a certified counselor for trafficking survivors, turning her natural instincts into professional skills to help others. "I wasn't invisible," Grace's clear voice rang through the courtroom. "They thought nobody would notice us, but they were wrong. There are good people who pay attention, who care enough to look closer when something seems wrong." Blackwood sat with his attorneys, his confident facade finally cracking as Grace described the system he had built. Each detail she recalled, the sounds, the smells, the routines, matched evidence found at multiple facilities. Her testimony helped prosecutors demonstrate the organization's consistent methods across borders. Dr. Wells had already been convicted in Singapore, her red notebook providing evidence that led to arrests in 12 countries. The International Task Force had traced every coded entry, identifying both victims and perpetrators with devastating precision. Outside the courthouse, David noticed a group of children with their parents, holding handmade signs. They were families from Lisa's school district, students and parents who had learned about trafficking prevention through new programs inspired by Grace's case. "The jury won't be long," Detective Rivera predicted, joining David in the corridor. She had just returned from Mexico, where another trafficking network had been exposed by children following Grace's example. When survivors speak truth to power, people listen. The investigation had sparked a global movement. Law enforcement agencies worldwide had revised their protocols for handling suspected trafficking cases. Grace's detailed drawings were now used in training sessions, teaching officers to value children's observations and take their report seriously. Lisa's stuffed animal initiative had grown into an international charity, legitimate this way, providing comfort items and art supplies to rescued children across the globe. Each package included a note saying, "You are seen. You are heard. You are believed." The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. But the real victory had come months earlier, when the last facility was shut down and the last child was brought to safety. Blackwood's conviction was just the final page of a chapter that had already ended. Grace celebrated the verdict by giving her testimony again, this time to a group of teachers and counselors training to spot signs of trafficking. Her story helped them understand that sometimes the biggest cry for help could come in the smallest gesture, like a child following a kind face through a parking lot. The International Task Force had evolved into a permanent coalition, with offices in 30 countries. David and Rivera were frequently consulted on cases, sharing lessons learned from Grace's case. The most important lesson: listen to the children. They see everything. One evening, David and Lisa hosted a gathering for survivors and their families. Their backyard was filled with laughter as children played freely, their parents watching with grateful tears. Grace moved among them like a quiet guardian, helping newer survivors feel safe and understood. "Remember when you asked me if it was almost over?" David said to Grace as they watched the sunset. "I didn't understand then that it was actually just beginning." Grace nodded, holding Mr. Cuddles close. The stuffed bear had become a symbol of hope for other children, his picture appearing on posters for survivor support programs worldwide. "Sometimes the scariest part is feeling alone," she said. "But nobody has to be alone anymore." The investigation had revealed that power and money could build walls of silence, but it had also proved that courage and compassion could tear those walls down. One child's bravery had sparked a movement. One woman's kindness had started a revolution. Lisa's classroom now included a special corner where children could share their worries through art. Similar spaces were appearing in schools globally, creating safe places for young voices to be heard. The drawings on these walls told stories of hope, not fear. As night fell and fireflies danced in the yard, David reflected on how a simple moment of noticing had changed countless lives. Grace's shadow in the parking lot had led them through darkness into light, reminding the world that evil flourishes only when good people look away. The children who had once been hidden in houses with barred windows were now visible, valuable members of their communities. Their stories were being told, their wisdom was being shared, and their courage was inspiring others to speak up. Grace had started a new drawing series, but these pictures showed something different: open doors, sunlit windows, and children playing freely. She called it her After collection, and copies hung in police stations and counseling centers around the world. "We all have shadows," Grace told a young survivor who asked about her story. "But shadows can't survive in places filled with light. That's why we have to keep helping others find their way out of the dark." What had begun with one child following one woman had become a global network of vigilance and support. The world had learned that the smallest actions could have the largest impacts, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil was simply paying attention. David and Lisa's story became a beacon of hope, teaching communities that safety comes from connection, that healing comes from being heard, and that change comes from ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things.